Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to a new video. Today we're going to talk about the nature of the nervous message. Let's start first by a quick review on the structure of the neuron or the nerve cell. This is a diagram of a neuron. This is the cell body of the neuron, where we see that there will be generation of the nervous message. Then these are the dendrites that are responsible for taking in or receiving the message, the signals. This part is called the axon hillock. It's like the neck of the neuron that connects the cell body to the axon. This is all the axon. And finally we have the axon terminals at the end of the axon. We know that when a stimulus takes place or happens, the nervous message propagates in this direction, from the dendrites to the cell body, then through the axon and to the axon terminals, going to another neuron. Now we're going today to understand how does this nervous message generates, what is its nature, how does it move, and so on. Now if we take a closer look to the axon hillock here, we can see that inside it there are a lot of channels or gates, just as you know that in the cell membrane, in any cell membrane, there are certain protein pumps, there are channels, gates. These proteins allow the entrance or the exit of certain ions and other substances, but they control them in a controlled manner. Now in this lesson we're only talking about channels and gates for ions. Okay, so these gates make what we call, or cause what we call, the resting potential of a neuron, where the outside of the neuron or the cell body is positive and the inside is negative, and this appears on the oscilloscope as the -70 millivolt. The value of the resting potential when there is no message, when the neuron is not doing anything, it is -70 millivolt. Now we're going to see why or what causes this resting potential. Why do we have inside the cell negative charge and outside positive charge? So again, if we connect a microelectrode to the cell body, for example, of a neuron, and another reference electrode that receives any electric impulse, both to an energetic apparatus, an oscilloscope, a galvanometer, any apparatus that receives electric impulses and measures it, we see that a value appears which is -70 millivolt. This value is referred to as the resting potential. This is the potential difference when the neuron is not receiving any message, it's not transmitting any message, it is in its resting state. Now this difference, if we connect the nerve fiber to an oscilloscope, we will see that if one electrode or both electrodes are connected to the outside of the nerve fiber, there is no difference. If both are connected to the inside, also there is no difference. But if we connect one to the inside and the other to the outside, we notice that the potential difference is -70 millivolt. This means when it gives us -70, that the nerve fiber is polarized. We have negative charge inside and positive charge outside. In order to understand why is there this potential difference between the inside and the outside of the cell, we're going to take a closer look to the cell membrane and the channels and pumps found inside them or inside it, and to the concentration of ions inside and outside the cell. Here we notice that outside the cell, or the extracellular space, we have a very high concentration of positive ions, such as an A+, Ca2+, K+, but mainly we have an A+ ions, and a few amount of negative ions, such as chloride ions. On the contrary, on the inside of the cell or the intracellular space, we see a lower concentration of positive ions and a high concentration of negative charge. Now the negative charge is not coming from the negative ions. We have a few negative ions inside the cell, but the negative charge comes from large proteins in the cell, inside the cell, that are negatively charged. We know that all the organelles inside the cell are made of proteins mainly, and these proteins, due to their structure, they have a negative charge. And since they cannot move outside the cell, they are inside the cell, they are big molecules and proteins. That's why the negative charge is predominant inside the cell. So again, outside the cell it is a positively charged space, while inside the cell we have a negative charge space. Between outside and inside the cell there is what we call an equilibrium. This equilibrium is due to the presence of leak channels. Leak channels are channels that allow the movement of ions with the concentration gradient, which means from high concentration to a low concentration, but in a slow rate. So here we see that, for example, the Na plus ions can enter inside the cell because outside there is more Na plus than inside, but in a slow manner. They leak, so they move slowly, while K plus ions move or leak outside the cell through K plus leak channels. In addition, we have this sodium-potassium pump that works using ATP. It needs energy. This sodium-potassium pump moves the Na plus and K plus ions against concentration gradient. So the Na plus move from low to high, while K plus move also from low to high. So here we see that the Na plus moves from inside the cell. They attach to certain spaces inside the pump. The ATP molecule comes and attaches to the pump, okay, from inside the cell, of course. Now, when they attach, the pump changes its shape. The Na plus ions go out of the cell. Here, the ATP now becomes ADP, and the one phosphorus ion is attached to the pump. Now K plus ions will attach from outside the cell into the pump, and the pump changes its conformation, so the K plus ions enter to the cell. This process that happens keeps the equilibrium inside and outside the cell as long as the neuron is not excited. There is no stimulation, there is nothing. So this is the resting state. There is a balance between outside and inside. Outside is positively charged and inside is negatively charged. This stage we can show it on the oscilloscope, for example, if we want to record something on a graph. We can see that it has this shape. The curve is in the minus 70 millivolt, so where there is no any excitation or any recorded potential difference. This is called the membrane resting potential or the resting state. This state here is the resting state or phase. Now what happens if stimulus happens? When a stimulus takes place, there are certain channels that are called voltage-gated channels. Voltage-gated channels means they are channels that function by voltage, by potential difference. If there is a change in voltage, these gates are activated. One of these gates is the Na plus voltage-gated channel, of course. When it is stimulated, when there is a stimulus, these gates are active, they open. When these gates open, the Na plus ions will flow very quickly inside the cell. So the Na plus ions will flow quickly inside the cell through these channels, these gates that are voltage gates for Na plus. Here, when they enter, now the equilibrium that we talked about previously, where there is positive outside and negative outside, it's changed. We have now a high concentration of positive ions inside, and so the charge inside is positive and the charge outside becomes negative. In this case, when we want to draw the curve, we can see that the curve starts to increase a little bit. Okay, this here now we have a potential difference. It's not resting anymore. There is a change. There is an increase in the potential difference. But here there is a very important note to take, that if the potential difference rises only less than the value that we call threshold value, which is minus 55 millivolt, if the increase is below this level, there is no generation of any potential action potential. Okay, but in order to have a generation of action potential, in order to have a generation of nervous message, the value of the potential difference should reach the threshold level. So the value of the intensity of the stimulus has to reach the threshold value. Any message or stimulus below the threshold value doesn't make a nervous message, doesn't cause a nervous message to be generated. Now, how does the nervous message generate? We said all the things that we talked about is only in one point. For example, here or here or here, only in one point. But if the nervous message or the stimulus caused all the gates in the cell membrane to open, and at the same time the Na plus ions enter to the cell body at the same time, or to the axon hillock, and so we have this influx, this strong influx of positive ions inside, and the negativity becomes outside. We have inside positive and now we have outside negative. This will cause an action potential to start. Why? Because it is above the threshold level. Now it's a strong stimulus, strong enough to generate an action potential. In this case, we call this phase depolarization. Now, why do we call it depolarization? It's called depolarization because the cell now is no longer polar. At the beginning, it was negative in the inside, positive on the outside, so it was polar. Now we switched the charge. Now it's positive in the inside and negative on the outside, so it is now depolarized. Now it is positive. It becomes 30 millivolt. The potential difference now is plus 30 millivolt, so it is depolarized. It reaches this peak, which is plus 30 millivolt. Now what happens next is that the Na plus gated, voltage gated channels are inactive, so no more Na plus ions can enter, while the K plus voltage gated channels are activated and K plus ions start to flow out of the cell, out of the axon. When this happens, the potential difference starts to decrease again, because now the cell is no longer only positive inside and negative outside. The positive now is getting out of the cell to make it positive outside again, and so we call this phase repolarization, because we want to return the cell to its original state where it is positive outside and negative inside. Now these K plus gates remain open for a longer period of time, and more K plus exits the cell. They take a longer time, and more K plus exits and goes out of the cell. That's why the potential difference decreases even more than minus 70 millivolt. It becomes more negative in the inside and more positive in the outside. This phase is called hyperpolarization. So it's more polar than what it was. It reaches about minus 80, minus 85 millivolt. Now, after all these phases pass, the cell has to return to its original state, which is resting potential or resting state. Here we see the importance of the leak channels again, where the Na plus have to return to the outside because they move with the concentration gradient. So the Na plus start to return outside and K plus ions return inside. Okay, because they are more in the outside, now they return inside. And on the same time, the Na plus K plus pump also works in order to return the balance, where Na plus ions move against the concentration gradient by the help of ATP, and K plus ions move also against their concentration gradient to get inside the cell. And so here we return to the resting phase or state, where the potential difference is equal to minus 70 millivolt, and here we can wait for another action potential to take place. There is possibility for another action potential to take place, and we go here. This leads us to how the nervous message is transmitted between or along the axon. If we look at the axon, okay, we see that, for example, everything we talked about happened in this point, let's say, okay, in this area of the axon, where inside there is positive, the charge switched, and the inside of the axon is positive, while the outside becomes negative. Then this change or this action potential leads to a change in the potential in the next area, next to this area. So there becomes an action potential here also, where the charge switches and all the gates open and whatnot. This also leads to a change in the next area. So in this way we see how the action potential starts to move along the axon from one point to another, all along the axon. Now what we are talking about here is the non-myelinated axon or neuron. Some of the nerve fibers in our body are not myelinated. They don't have myelin sheath, such as the ones in the central nervous system inside the brain, but most of the nerves are myelinated. They are covered by myelin sheath, and of course between the myelin sheath we have the nodes of Ranvier. Since some nerves are very long inside our body, like the sciatic nerve, for example, which connects our feet and legs to the spinal cord, how does the nerve message move very quickly through them, although they are long nerves? Here we see the importance of the myelin sheath. Let's take this myelinated axon, for example. We see here an action potential that happens at this point due to the presence of myelin, and for a certain reason the action potential will move into the next node of Ranvier without passing through this area where it is myelinated. So here we see as if the nervous message or the action potential, as if it's jumping from one area to another. Let's say, for example, here the potential difference now moves to the third node of Ranvier as if it is jumping. This movement or conduction is called saltatory conduction, where the action potential moves from one node of Ranvier to another, and this conduction is faster than when there are no myelin sheath, because it is now taking less time to move throughout the long neuron. And now, in order to summarize what we talked about in the video, the action potential is made of four main phases. The first phase is called the resting state or resting phase, where the resting potential is minus 70 millivolt, and we don't have any nervous message, any change, any recording, and during this state the extracellular space is positively charged, while the inside or the intracellular space is negatively charged around the axon. But when a stimulus takes place, and this stimulus is equal or above the threshold level, which is minus 55 millivolt, the resting state changes, and we see a depolarization, where the potential difference increases rapidly and reaches the peak, which is plus 30 millivolt. During this phase, the Na plus voltage gated channels open, and Na plus ions flow rapidly inside the cell, and the cell becomes negatively charged on the outside, positively charged on the inside. Now, of course, we're talking about the neuron, the nerve cell. After that, there becomes or repolarization starts, where the cell have to return, or the potential difference have to return to its original state. This happens when the K plus channels open and K plus ions start to flow outside of the neuron, so they return the charge outside to positive and the inside to negative. But after repolarization we have hyperpolarization, where the K plus channels keep open for a longer period of time. The K plus ions keep going outside of the cell, so the cell now is more positive on the outside and more negative in the inside. This state should not stay for a long time. It has to go back to the resting state, where this occurs by the help of Na plus K plus pumps and the leak channel, where they return the ions to their original places, Na plus ions on the outside and K plus ions in the inside. That would be everything for today. I hope the information were clear. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to come back for new videos. Goodbye.